Well, thank you for coming on our show, Senator Coons. We appreciate it. We asked you today to come on to talk about hunger, but first I wanted to ask you about the Senate's plan to reconvene on Monday. They're expecting you to come back to Washington. How do you feel about that?
Shawn, I don't think that we should be returning to Washington without a compelling, pressing agenda that requires our action and a clear plan for how to provide for the safety of those who work in the Capitol and in the Senate buildings in order to make it possible for us to return. I'll remind you and our listeners that out of the 100 senators, there's a majority that are in their 60s or older and thus fit the profile of being vulnerable to COVID-19. But also when we return, there are hundreds of people who have to come into work, whether they're Capitol Police or they work in facilities maintenance and service and support or food service. And we don't have a detailed plan that I'm aware of, at least, to provide them all with personal protective equipment, to provide for hand sanitizer and social distancing. So I frankly think we are not just violating the District of Columbia shelter-in-place rules and those rules and restrictions in many of our home states, but we're also asking those who work in the Senate to take unnecessary risks when the only agenda item we know of right now for this coming week is the confirmation of is the confirmation of judicial nominees.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, the House is planning to consider a proposal to allow some sort of remote voting. The Senate doesn't seem to have broached that topic. Are you hearing anything about that? Would you support a remote voting plan?
There's been some vigorous discussion. I think Senator Durbin was trying to work out with Senator Blunt a proposal, and certainly Senator Blunt, as chairman of Rules, and Ranking Member Klobuchar, I think have had some discussions, but I don't think because of the opposition of Majority Leader McConnell that it's proceeded very far. Certainly my impression is that we don't yet have a plan in place for emergency remote voting, although we should, because it's foreseeable, whether now or during a reemergence of this pandemic in the fall, that we will have real challenges. If we return this coming week and several senators or their senior staff or the folks who work with and for us in the Capitol contract COVID-19 as a result of our returning, what will we do then? We should have a clear path forward. And frankly, Shawn, that's also a transition for another point that I think requires us to plan. Senator Klobuchar and I are working hard to advance the idea that we should provide the funding and the legal authorization for states all over the country to vote by mail. In Delaware, we have a primary in mid-September, and we don't want to see a repeat of what just happened in Wisconsin, where thousands of people were forced to choose between protecting their own family's health and safety and exercising their constitutionally critical right to vote. There were, I think, 7 people who were infected as a result of voting in Wisconsin. South Korea has recently pulled off a safe and high participation national election, but it required allowing people to vote remotely and significant investments to make sure that for those polling places that were open, they could do so safely. I think it's important for us to not just have a plan for how the Senate can vote safely, but a plan for how all Americans can vote safely in the upcoming state primaries and in the all-important November elections.
On the question of Congress reconvening, some lawmakers have argued that essential workers are going to work, even in places where they have stay-at-home orders, such as grocery clerks, Amazon delivery people, train drivers. And they are saying that Congress should also be considered an essential workforce. What to that argument?
Well, I'll say this first. Many of us are working very hard because, frankly, this is a time when every small business and small nonprofit, every health leader, every hospital executive and doctor or nurse who knows me and who knows how to reach me or who's called my office is seeking help. So the folks who work on my team here in Delaware are certainly essential workers and are putting in very long hours handling constituent cases, as am I. But the question here really is, does that require us to all travel to Washington and to reconvene? If we do that, we should be conducting oversight of how the Trump administration has been dispersing the record amount of funds, the literally trillions of dollars in funds that were appropriated through the CARES Act and the 3 other bills that we've done. Instead of having an agenda that includes oversight, right now our agenda just includes confirmation of judicial nominees, and I frankly don't think that that is an urgent, essential function of Congress that requires 100 members and their staff to reconvene in the Senate body.
Okay, on to hunger. You
Yes.
are on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. You have been an advocate of foreign aid, a strong advocate. At this time, the United Nations says that 265 million people across the world are in danger of starvation because of COVID-19 and the associated lockdowns. The United States would normally come to the rescue in a situation of famine. Will we be able to this time?
We are certainly able to. The question is whether we are willing to. I have a great respect for the professionals at USAID, our development professionals around the world who are out there on the front lines each and every day, and Governor David Beasley, who helps lead one of the critical organizations through the United Nations that delivers hunger relief assistance to countries all over the world. So both directly through USAID and our Food for Peace program, and indirectly through the multinational efforts that Governor Beasley and his team leads, I do think we are capable of once again being the indispensable nation that helps fund the resources to feed a hungry world. And I hope that we will find the political will to do that. Having done a number of town halls, both teletown halls and video conferences with folks up and down my state, I understand how Delawareans and most Americans are very focused on their own families, their own businesses, their own schools, and their own neighborhoods. But I do think part of what distinguishes us as a nation is our long history of providing critically needed assistance to people around the world. So I think we should do this again. I plan to fight for this in our appropriations process on the State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee, and I've already submitted this year's appropriations requests that would significantly increase our hunger relief investments around the world.
The developed world is having trouble coping with this vaccine,
Yes.
With this virus, obviously. It raises the question, is the developing world going to be able to cope with it, at least as well as we are? Or is this going to be a disaster?
It is going to be a disaster. I've recently done a number of calls with faith leaders, with national leaders, with private sector leaders who I know from across Africa and from around the developing world, as well as calls with a number of leaders of some of our most prominent nonprofits. And already the signals are greatly concerning from Central and South America, from Africa, from Southeast Asia. These are countries with fragile health systems that have very little in the way of additional resources to confront a new pandemic. And I am hopeful that the world will respond in an appropriate and timely way. I am encouraged that President Trump has recently done phone calls with the presidents of, I believe, Nigeria and Ethiopia, and committed himself to sending them ventilators and PPE and other relief. But frankly, we're going to need to do a whole lot more than a few phone calls and a few pledges of support. I also frankly think we need to be engaged in the debt relief efforts that are already underway at the IMF and the World Bank. A number of critical developing countries have already been stretched too far by having taken on debt for development projects. I'm working with my staff to figure out what's the appropriate way to make sure that we're not simply refinancing bad debt that was taken on in Belt and Road projects that were not transparent or weren't appropriately planned. But I do think there is something to be said for us making sure that countries in the developing world have access to personal protective equipment, to ventilators, to testing material, and hopefully ultimately to a vaccine, but that they also have the capacity to raise the funds and to spend the funds as they see fit for the health, education, and welfare of their own people.
We actually seem to have a surplus of some food in the United States. Farmers are dumping milk. They're slaughtering piglets because they can't get them to market. Restaurants aren't buying food, cafeterias aren't buying food. Can we get that food to the people who need it?
I think this is a critical issue, and I appreciate the engagement of the White House and the executive branch in this, and also the engagement of advocates for labor and for the communities around the poultry processing plants in my own state, as well as beef and pork processing plants in other places. This is critically an issue of worker safety. First, we have to make sure that anybody who is going to work in a processing plant has quality personal protective equipment, has worker social distancing or spacing practices implemented and respected, and has confidence that they're going to be able to work and not go home and infect or reinfect their families or neighbors or communities. So if those who are providing for the safety of workers in the workplace do their job responsibly, and if the executive branch helps deliver in a timely way the testing resources and the PPP resources that we need, it is possible to keep our processing plants open and to not see a significant interruption of the food supply here in the United States. But this is going to take a coordinated federal-state effort. And bluntly, so far, it's been disappointing, the lack of real coordination between the federal stockpiles and resources and the states and cities and communities that have needed timely access to those resources. So I'm hopeful we can get it right on this particular issue.
What about the president's executive order? It's come into some criticism because some have said that it's more about keeping the food flowing, keeping profits for the meat packers, and not protecting the workers.
Well, that's why my comments began with emphasizing the importance of keeping workers safe. We have a number of plants around the country where a significant number of workers are refusing to come to work because they're not convinced it's safe. And I think that's where this response has to begin, is by not just trying to persuade them that it's safe, but showing that there is a commitment to providing the personal protective equipment, the safe places for those who are infected or become infected to be quarantined or have access to health care. You know, a lot of these processing plants are in fairly rural areas with hospitals that need additional resources, that need ventilators and need access to testing equipment and material, and need the funding to be viable. So it is not unreasonable for workers to be concerned about their safety, and I think the first step in making sure that processing plants are able to stay open is making it clear that there is a sustained commitment to the health and safety of workers from the President of the United States, from the Department of Agriculture, from OSHA, as well as from state leaders. Here in my state of Delaware, I'm confident that Governor Carney is striking the right balance on this, but there's lots of states at issue here, and there's lots of different industries involved.
Last question for you, Senator. You mentioned how you've been able to keep up with constituent service work, working remotely, working from your district offices. But what about oversight? Congress has just appropriated almost $3 trillion to deal with the virus and its economic ramifications. How can Congress oversee that money, oversee the executive branch, when it's not able to get back to the Capitol?
Well, we should be working out the rules of the road for us to do remote hearings. That's different from a markup at which legislation or nominations are advanced. But we should be doing remote hearings. It is entirely possible to safely have witnesses appear, provide testimony and documents, have members question, and publicize the results. So I do think we should be doing oversight. And I frankly think the odds that in many of our states we're going to be living under shelter-in-place orders for weeks or months is fairly high. I'll remind you that both Dr. Fauci and Dr. Redland have predicted a second round of this pandemic in the fall that'll be coincident with flu and cold season. If it follows anything like the pattern of the 1918 pandemic influenza, the second round in the fall and winter could be even more lethal than the first. So I do think we should be planning ahead. Part of what's happened over the last 6 weeks is the chaos of trying to catch up with having not planned and not prepared enough in January and February as this pandemic was spreading across the United States. We should be doing the things that are essential to looking forward. providing the resources for vote by mail, providing the investment in resources for national service so that hundreds of thousands of young people can help with contact tracing and testing and, God willing, later vaccination, and making sure that the Senate and the House can conduct oversight in a meaningful way. That's how we'll make sure that federal agencies from the IRS, which is distributing stimulus checks, to the Small Business Administration, and how they're distributing PPP funds. We have to be doing oversight, and we don't have to do that in person in the Capitol.
A stark warning. Thank you, Senator Coons, for joining us today.
Thank you, Shawn.
Appreciate it. Sorry about our technical difficulties. We're still working through our new world.
I appreciate the chance to be on. Look forward to doing it again.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you. Thank you, sir.